We're reading from Daniel 7, which is page 893 to 894. Daniel's dream of four beasts. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, "In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me were four winds of heaven churning up to the great sea. Four great beasts, each different from others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up in one of its sides. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up and eat your fill of flesh.' After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings, like those of a bird. The beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I think about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a human, and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I looked, his clothing was as white as snow. The hair on his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain, and its body was destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming into the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me. I approached one of those standing there and asked him the meaning of all this. So he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. The 4 great beasts are 4 kings that will rise from the earth. But the holy people, the Most High, will ever receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. Then I wanted to know the meaning of the 4th beast, which was different from all the others and most terrifying with its iron teeth and bronze claws. The beast that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head and about the other horn that came up, before which 3 of them fell. The horn that looked most imposing more than others, and that had eyes and a mouth and spoke boastfully. As I watched, this horn was waging war against the holy people and defeating them, until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favour of the holy people of the Most High. And the time came when they possessed the kingdom. He gave me his explanation. The 4th beast is a 4th kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them, another kingdom will arise. Different from the earlier ones, he will subdue 3 kings. He will speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people and try to change the set times and the laws. The holy people will be delivered into his hands for a time, times and a half a time. But the court will sit, and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom will be everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. This is the end of the matter. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts, and my face turned pale, but I kept the matter to myself.
It's been said that propaganda wins wars. Propaganda is information that promotes a particular political cause or point of view, you see, because what people see and what they hear and believe, actually more than that, what people feel about what's going on around them makes a massive difference to how they respond. So we see it today in the wars raging in places like the Ukraine and the Middle East, where different people have their different stories and their political agendas kind of shape and form the stories and the information that they share. One particularly impressive piece of war propaganda was by this guy, Sefton Delmer, who I only found out about this week, but he was a journalist in World War II. And he, rather than trying to oppose the Nazi regime directly with facts and beliefs and truth and that kind of thing, he sought to undermine it from the inside by telling stories over the radio that seemed to support Hitler and Nazism, but depicted how grotesque and how self-serving and how decadent the Nazi regime was. So he tapped into, through these stories, the immorality and the injustice that was at the heart of the Nazi regime. And over time, therefore, he helped turn many ordinary German citizens against Nazism. See, it's not just straightforward facts and beliefs that capture our attention and think about how we and influence how we think and live, but it's stories and visions that get hold of us, that engage our senses and that teach us how to think and feel about what we experience, and so how to live in response. It's part of why we love movies so much. Without really realizing it, the movies that we watch are helping us interpret life as we experience and work out how to live in the world. And that is why we're going to love the second half of the book of Daniel. Because in it, we move from stories in chapters 1 to 6 of life in exile, and it giving us examples of what it looks like for God's people to live faithfully under the empires of the world and live faithfully to God in the midst of that. That's the first half of the book. And now we're going into the second half of the book, and it's a series of dreams and visions that Daniel had about God's purposes and plans in history. Effectively, these dreams and visions are like propaganda in the wartime that help us to interpret life as we experience it and learn how to live with kingdom endurance amidst the empires of the world. And chapter 7 that Cam just read to us is the first vision in this series of visions. And actually, it's the central one in the book. This chapter has a real central place. It draws together most of what we've seen so far, and it also kind of sets up the agenda for what's coming. The chapter, quite simply, if you keep it open on page 893, it'll be helpful. We're going to look at it as we go. Splits into two halves. In verses 1 to 14, Daniel has this great and terrifying vision in a dream. And then in the second half, 15 to 28, he gets the meaning of the dream through this conversation with an angel. Now essentially, what goes on in this chapter reveals two things, and it's summarized in verses 17 and 18 in the middle. And you can look at them there if you want. Firstly, that worldly empires and powers that be in the world are like wild beasts. And so in seeing that, that's to cause some sense of fear and concern. But secondly, verse 18, the holy people of the Most High God will in the end receive the kingdom and possess it forever. And so that is a reason for great hope and great resilience for the people of God. This is a vision of the kingdom of God that in the end overcomes all the empires. And of course, we've been seeing that, haven't we, in the book of Daniel so far. It's a relatively simple meaning, really, at the heart of this chapter. But when you grab hold of it, it turns the world on its head, and it radically reinterprets for Daniel and his friends what they experienced and what was going on around them so that they could live through it. And if we rightly see this vision together this morning, then it radically reinterprets for us what we experience in life, and so how we can live with kingdom endurance through it. Well, to help us grasp this, we need to realize that what we're reading here in Daniel chapter 7 and through the rest of the book, and what we're seeing is these what's called apocalyptic writing and visions. It's not just narrating a series of historical events, but it is showing us a divine perspective, God's perspective on history through these visions that are often overstated and exaggerated and sometimes quite grotesque. And listen, apocalyptic is a type of writing that has its own rules and its own style, and it's helpful for us just to be aware of a few basics of that as we head into it. Now, we're quite used to a lot of this because of the films we watch that teaches us how to engage with this stuff really well. So like a good Disney film, apocalyptic has layers to it. and different meanings that different audiences can take from the one story at the same time. Or maybe like a good film from the Marvel Cinematic Universe that is full of imagery and symbolism and tone and feel, and that is all very meaningful, and that helps us navigate what is going on. So you kind of just know when a good or a bad guy is on the screen because of the musical score, because of the stuff visually that's coming in, the colors and the images. And like maybe a Tarantino film or a collage film, it's often fast-paced. It's a little bit trippy. It's kind of dreamlike. There's images being layered one on the other, and it's all about the overall big picture and the overall feel, not drilling in necessarily to the minute points of detail. So just bear in mind these kind of types of film that we watch and we just naturally kind of know what's going on. That we've got to apply these kind of rules as we read this. And in this vision, in Daniel 7, there's two character types that we need to see, and through them we learn how to live with kingdom endurance. And the first type of character we see it is the beasts of earth, and we are to fear the beasts of earth. The chronology, the timeline resets a little at the start of chapter 7. We're now back in the first year of King Belshazzar. He was the last king of Babylon. And we read that Daniel has this dream at night as these visions pass through his mind. And in verse 2, he looks and he sees the four winds of heaven churning up the great sea. Now, in the Bible's imagery, the sea represents the place in creation of chaos and of disorder. It's a godless place from where evil comes. And so up out of the churning sea comes these four great and mighty beasts, one after the other. The first we read looks like a lion, the second like a bear, the third like a leopard, and the fourth is so terrible and ghastly that Daniel can't even imagine or find any reference point for what it looks like. There's no animal metaphor to describe it. In verse 17, Daniel is told that these four beasts are kings that will rise from the earth in his day and the centuries that followed. Actually, the lion, it was used back in ancient times to depict the kingdom of Babylon that Daniel lived in. And here we read that its eagle wings have been torn off it, and it stood up like a human and given a human mind. And it seems to reflect an echo of what we've seen of the fall and the restoration of Nebuchadnezzar as the king of Babylon. And then the Mede and Persian Empire and the Greeks and the Romans were all followed, great empires in its wake in the following centuries. All of them different, but in their own ways, beastly, devouring and destroying all that is before them with their great authority and power. It's a proper, gruesome nightmare when you just pause on some of this imagery, isn't it? Now, Bible scholars debate exactly which kingdoms, earthly kingdoms, are being depicted here, but that's a point of detail that isn't that significant for us today. This clearly echoes Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2 that we saw a few weeks ago, where we saw that great statue of gold and silver and bronze and iron, and all the scholars agree these beasts are clearly representing worldly rulers and kingdoms of the ancient world. This is an insight from heaven on the powers that be of Daniel's day. It is a terrifying and frightening portrayal of what human power and authority looks like when it becomes untethered from any sense of fear of God, any sense of divine accountability. I think these beasts have a twofold significance for us today. Firstly, they give us a heavenly perspective on the authorities and powers that be of the world in our day as well. This isn't just history, but this is an insight into our times. This nightmare shows a God's eye view on all the worldly empires and kingdoms that have come and gone through history since Daniel saw this vision, and those that are yet to come until Jesus returns. In fact, do you see, I don't know if you noticed, but Daniel kind of gets hooked on this fourth beast. He becomes a bit obsessed by it. It's so terrifying and it's so evil, and yet he can't stop looking at it and thinking about it. Now, a feature of apocalyptic writing is the significance of numbers. And the number 4 in apocalyptic shows that something is complete, something is comprehensive, something is worldwide. I think the reason that it's so difficult to specifically identify which kingdom or empire or ruler the fourth beast represents here is because it does not represent any single empire or ruler or kingdom or system, but it represents in totality all of the systems and empires and rulers that have turned away from God. Effectively, he's just called number 4, the universal beast. He's in a class of itself. This is a picture of human power and authority without God. This is a human empire in which evil and rebellion reaches its apex. And so in verse 19 to 25 there, Daniel digs into the details on this fourth beast with his angel tour guide. And he gets an insight in what it looks like for the powers to be beastly. And really, 3 things kind of emerge as he has this discussion. We see that powers and worldly powers and authorities, they're all about authority and power. But that culminates in division and disunity. This is the horn imagery. What it represents in apocalyptic is power and authority. And there's this fourth beast with these 10 horns, meaning he's properly powerful. And yet where there's brute power, there's always fighting and division and disunity, isn't there? And so we see that, this little horn that comes up and dislodges and supplants these other horns. There's kind of this infighting going on in this power game. The second thing we see about the beasts of earth is that they're absolutely brutal. And they just leave victims in their wake. And in particular, that culminates in the persecution of the people of God. People are crushed and devoured by these systems and these rulers with their iron teeth and their bronze claws, and they're trampled underfoot. And in particular, the people of God are actively persecuted and violently oppressed by the beastly authorities of this world. It's just heartbreaking to hear what we've already heard this morning about what everyday Christians like us are facing today. And these beasts, we read, are allowed to do this for a time, times, and half a time, meaning quite a long but a set period of time that will come to an end. And the third big thing that we see in these verses about the beastly authority of the world is that they are full of proud blasphemy and self-deification, making themselves gods. And so that culminates in seeking to displace and replace God. These powers make great boast. They speak against the true God who is there. They try and take his power and authority upon themselves in trying to change the set times and the laws, acting like and claiming to be God in different ways. So we don't need to make this stuff relevant to us by seeking these exact parallels in this imagery, saying, the 10 horns of beast number 4, that must be the 10 founding states of the European Union in the 1970s, and, it's all going wrong since then. No, but we can spot echoes of this in the world system of our day, can't we? There's a leader in our world today, Kim Jong-un, who claims and even demands godlike status from his people. And it would be funny if it wasn't so tragic and so devastating for people who live there. There's Putin brutally oppressing people under and around him. There's the way that communist systems control and restrict people, and the way that capitalist societies like our own leave so many people chewed up and spat out and trampled underfoot. There's moves in our UK Parliament and government to liberalise laws on abortion and assisted dying so that these authorities overreaching themselves and not valuing and honouring and protecting the most vulnerable amongst us like they are tasked to do. There's countries like Eritrea and Somalia, amongst many others, where there are laws of the land that prohibit and inhibit the worship of the God of the Bible. And there's endless wars and division and infighting that marks out our internal politics in our country and also shapes the way that we relate to other image bearers of God in our international relations. We could go on and go on and go on. Some powers and authorities are more subtle about it than others. The way it looks here looks quite subtle. But make no mistake, the kings and the rulers of the earth are nothing more than brute beasts when they forget who God is and who they are. In fact, it's fascinating today, isn't it, how our countries, our great nations and empires choose wild and strong beasts to depict their strength and might. Whether it's the British lion or the American eagle, or the Chinese dragon, or the Russian bear, these great beasts, for that is what they ultimately are. And they show themselves to be it. Whatever common grace might come to us through them, whatever things you might be thankful to God for from these institutions and these places, we ought not be so naive and gullible or even hopeful that these powers and authorities and these systems and rulers can deliver only what God can. So Daniel is quite rightly, deeply troubled, we read, by his thoughts. He's disturbed by this. And listen, we should be troubled and disturbed. You should be unsettled as you hear these things. In fact, every human manifestation of evil is ultimately a copycat of what the Bible depicts as a great dragon. The serpent, the Satan, the first opposer of God and his people, who violently disrupts. If you could just flick that switch, guys, that will help it not go again. Thank you. Who violently disrupts and controls and manipulates, who opposes and attacks, who proudly elevates himself. History is beastly. It is evil and it is terrifying, and we must see it as such. But there's a second significance of this vision for us. And this is where it gets a little more personal, a little more uncomfortable. Because I think in this we're to see that we too can be beastly. This is a dreadful warning of what we can be like if left to our own devices. Luke Borblet helped us see this when he preached on the life of King Nebuchadnezzar from chapter 4. And he said, when humans turn away from the God who made us in his image and for his glory, we lose our humanity and we become brute beasts. Genesis 1, 26 to 28, I think is the most incredibly dignifying and also the most terrifying verses in the Bible. They're there on the screen, but you might want to turn to them. I just want to read these verses. It's about the creation account. God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. God blessed them. And he said to them, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves along the ground. Each and every one of us, as those made in the very image and the likeness of God, have been made to rule and reign over his creation, including all of the beasts and all of the animals, and to reign under God's ultimate reign and rule according to his good design for his purposes, for his glory, and ultimately for our collective good. That is such a dignifying thing. And yet the terrifying thing is that when that goes wrong, oh my, it goes wrong. Ever since the first humans turned away from God's good word and his loving rule, ever since they listened to the beast, the serpent in the garden, we have all, each of us, turned to our own devices and turned to our own ways and our grand plans and ideas about how life should look and how we should rule and reign in the world. And in our own ways, we have all become little more than brute beasts over our kingdoms and our empires, over the parts of the world that we have some authority over. Where and when do you act more like a beast than an image bearer? Where do you use power and authority that you have, however little it might be, for your own ends, leading inevitably to division and disunity with people around you? Where do you trample down others as you get ahead? Where do you make great boasts and glorify self, seeking to make your name great? I was convicted when Luke preached on this a few weeks ago of how much I can be a beast of a parent. I wonder about you. Can you be a beast of a spouse? Beast of a friend? Beast of an employee? A beast of a family member? A beast of a teammate? A beast of a neighbor? In what context does this stuff come out for you? We all have it in us, don't we? In the end, we become like beasts in one way or another. You're probably thinking, great, I'm glad I came to church today. I'm going to come back next week. Give me more of that. Well, let's just hold on. You'll see what's coming. But before we see the second half, what Daniel 7 shows us is God says an eternal no to that way of living. In verse 11, the beast is slain and thrown into the fire. And in verse 26, the beast's power will be taken away, we read, and will be completely destroyed forever. You see, before God, we are all found wanting. We really appreciate, don't we, the thought that there is divine justice for the dictators and the tyrants of history. But most of us want divine justice to stop before it gets to my door. But what if it doesn't? And what if the same kinds of things that make them such beasts are also found in me? Maybe to a slightly different extent, but nonetheless the same type of things. Listen, as much as we are to fear the beast out there, as much as we are to fear the beast within as well, we ought ultimately rightly to fear the God who condemns and judges and will one day bring an end to that way of living. He promises to do it. Well, that's our first character, the beasts of the earth. And that's the bad news. Here's the good news half. So don't walk out just now. Come back. Timing. Hope in the man of heaven. See, in the midst of this vision of the great beast, Daniel sees something else. In fact, he sees someone else. And this gives him much food for thought and many reasons to hope. You see, look at this. In verse 9, he looks a second time. And he sees this vision of this great courtroom and thrones are set in place. And the Ancient of Days takes his seat. And here Daniel gets a glimpse of a very rare thing indeed. He gets a direct vision of the true and living God, the Ancient of Days, the ruler of all things and all people and all places. You see, even while we must be alert to and see and understand the terror and the reality of the evil in the world and our lives, as Christians, we must also see our gods. Our God high and lifted up, our God in his glory and his splendor and his majesty. We can't just see one and not the other. And what Daniel sees and observes is this heavenly court, this heavenly throne room. And it gives him many reasons to take heart. Now, in apocalyptic visions, what's going on around a character tells you most of what you need to know about them. And so, particularly as Daniel sees God, the Ancient of Days, so much of it is describing what he sees around him. He sees that his clothing is as white as snow and his hair is white like wool. This is representing both his supreme wisdom. You know, for us still, grey hair or white hair represents wisdom, doesn't it? But also his perfect purity, a God in whom there is no shadow. He sees that his throne is ablaze with fire, with flaming fire and a river of fire flowing from it. And this reflects his radiant purity, his blazing holiness and his goodness and his justice and his fearsome power to destroy his enemies as a consuming fire. Thousands upon thousands attend him and stand before him, pointing us to his majesty and his greatness and his worth. He's the one on whom everyone's eyes are fixed. He's where everyone's attention is drawn. And the court is seated as the books are opened. He's like a judge sitting down in his courtroom, cool, calm, and collected, even while the beasts of earth thrash and rage in their fury. He isn't worried or threatened. He will see that justice ultimately is done. God not only revealed facts of history and perspective on history to Daniel, but God revealed himself. He showed him who he is and what he's like. In the midst of the Babylonian Empire, Daniel needs to see this vision of God. And listen, we need to see this vision of God today too. We're not to lose our head with all that's going on in the world around us. We must see God high and lifted up. We must see God in the control room of the universe, in the heavenly court, seated, because he's not ultimately under threat. He's not worried. He's not panicked. He's not wondering how it's all going to turn out. He's not worried about losing control in the world out there or in my life in here. We must see the one who is all wisdom and purity and might and strength and power and authority and all love. We must by faith and through prayer approach God's throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. So Daniel sees God. But there's one more thing for us to see. In fact, one more person to see. Because you see in verse 13, he looks for a third time. And he sees his third vision, and he sees one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He's already seen one like a lion. He's seen one like a bear. He's seen one like a leopard. Now he sees one like a man, like a human being. One who maintains a dignified human likeness against all these terrifying beastly ones. One alone who is truly human, who truly depicts and lives up to what it means to be the one who bears God's image and God's likeness in this world. The one who is a little lower than the angels, crowned with glory and honor. The one who is the ruler over the works of God's hand and with everything set under his feet. Daniel sees here a vision of the truly good and perfect human. The type of human you and I were made and called to be, but have failed to be. You know, when we mess up and we show our beastly side in some way, we often use the excuse, oh, I'm only human after all. I'm only human. Of course that justifies or explains my failings or my weakness and my sins. But here we see that to be truly human is to be truly good, is to be perfect, to live up to what and who we've been made to be, and so to be acceptable to God. This Son of Man approaches the Ancient of Days, and he is led into his presence. He is the only perfectly good one who can just waltz into the presence of God and is a God who is pure and wise and perfect and powerful and fiery. As we read in Psalm 24, he is the only one who can ascend the mountain of God, who has clean hands and a pure heart. So we see this perfect human, but we also see this Son of Man is coming with the clouds of heaven. Now that is most definitely apocalyptic for this is God. This is what God does. The one from heaven who is ultimately in charge of all things. This is the reigning and the glorious King. And so verse 14, he's given all authority and all glory and all sovereign power so that all nations and all peoples of every language worship him, and his dominion is an everlasting dominion. And his kingdom is a kingdom that will not pass away, that will never be destroyed. It's interesting that one of Jesus' favorite names for himself is Son of Man. This is who he says he is. It's who he claims to be. And the people around him at the time, they knew, they could see this flesh and blood human before them, but they were in no doubt that the scandal of him taking that title for himself was his claim to be none other than God himself, the one who rules and reigns in all power and authority, the one who comes on the clouds of heaven. But Jesus doesn't just claim to be the Son of Man, but he ultimately fulfills this vision of Daniel. So after he is brutally murdered by the Romans on the cross, Jesus is physically raised from the dead. And a few weeks later, he tells his friend, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. It belongs to me. And then his friends saw him physically ascend up to heaven in the clouds, and he was led into the presence of the Ancient of Days, and he was welcomed home, a triumphant and a good king. Received home with the rapturous applause of heaven. And now you think Daniel's dream from going to being an absolute nightmare, Daniel's having a great night. He is seeing in this dream none other than Jesus himself and his ascension up into heaven. He is seeing the second person of the Trinity, God the Son, who a few centuries after Daniel sees this vision will walk onto the pages of human history for all of us to see and to hear about. He is seeing the only truly good and perfect human, but also God himself, who possesses within himself all authority and all power and all glory. He is seeing the one whose kingdom will never, ever be destroyed and whose kingdom will outlast them all. He is seeing the one who is worthy of our worship and our adoration and our praise and our very lives, whatever our nation or language or people group. Here's the mad thing I want us to see to close. And this is a pinch yourself moment. Look at verse 18 again. The holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. Verse 27. Then the sovereignty, the power, the greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to who? The holy people of the Most High. See what this means? What Jesus has by right, he shares with us. There's a day that he gives it to us. Yes, us. Look around. This is us. He gives us his kingdom. He gives us the sovereignty and the power and the greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven. In the fullness of time, they will be given to the people of God. We will inherit the whole earth. In the end, Christ will ensure that his holy people, those who have put their hope and their trust in him, will finally be who they are made to be, will finally be the good rulers and the good image bearers in God's creation, ruling and reigning along with him and under God, just as we were destined to be. And every beastly tendency will once and forever be removed. That is for us. That's for the Christians locked up in Eritrea today. So Christians being killed even right now in Somalia and North Korea and elsewhere. As the heavenly court sits at the end of days and all of the beastly power is taken away, all evil in this world and in us will be completely destroyed and removed forever. And in that day of divine judgment, where all that is beastly is gone and condemned, the people of the Most High God, who through history have been opposed and oppressed and mocked and laughed at and scorned and beaten and passed over and ignored and pitied by the powers that be, in that day, those people will be vindicated. They will be raised up and inherit the fullness of all the kingdoms forever and ever. Yes, forever and ever. This is why, while it is probably wise to have a healthy dose of fear about evil in the world and evil in your life and all of that, we also ought to have a whole load of hope. A whole load of hope. And we in the church ought to be known as a people of hope because of and in Jesus. This is a vision of the certainty of final victory. It is a vision that in the end God's people possess the eternal kingdom because our hope and our trust is in the man of heaven, Jesus Christ. And that is why these visions are so valuable to us. That's why we've got so much to see and to learn, that we may continue to hope in God and in Jesus. For those who endure to the end will surely and finally and fully be saved. Let's pray and then we will sing in response. Just take a moment, quiet in our own hearts, to prayerfully respond before the Ancient of Days.